The purpose of this lecture and PowerPoint is to go over some things we can measure about the heart. And the PowerPoint will be posted, and then this is the narration. First of all, we want to get into heart sounds. To understand heart sounds, first I want to go through a wrong idea that a lot of people believe. Many people believe that the two sides of the heart beat in sequence, one right after another, and that this makes the two-part sound that you hear in a stethoscope. It is a wrong idea. The two sides of the heart are doing the same thing at the same time, except they do have pump the blood to different places. So what heart sounds actually are, what you hear through a stethoscope, is often described as lub-dub. The first sound is when the both AV valves close at the same time. So blood has come into the atria, gone down to the ventricles, and the AV valves both close, the left and right, tricuspid and mitral. That creates the first sound. Then when the ventricles contract and send the blood up to the aorta or pulmonary trunk, then the semilunar valves close. This creates the second sound. There is a link on the PowerPoint if you want to hear some actual heart sounds. The website is a training website for doctors. People can have valve problems. A common problem, very common problem, is a mitral valve prolapse, or what's commonly known as a heart murmur. It can be extensive or very, very minor where a person doesn't know they have it. AV valves can be replaced using artificial valves or very often pig heart valves. So again, if you ever hear the word heart cycle basically is a term for both of the atria filling, both the left and right atriums or atria, and both ventricles contract at the same time. This is how the heart cycles. Well, actually, this is important to understand because when the ventricles are filling and they're relaxed, you have a lower amount of pressure going through the aorta and the arteries. This is called diastole. When the ventricles contract, there's more pressure, more pushing out of the blood against the aorta and arteries. This is called systole. The reason we care about this is when we put a blood pressure cuff on somebody's arm or limb, we measure both blood pressures. We measure two numbers. The top number is called the systolic pressure. That's the higher number. That reflects the ventricles contracting and putting more force there's more force of blood against the blood vessels. Smaller number, diastolic, is when the ventricles are filling or relaxing. The next slide here shows what we call a typical or normal blood pressure around 120/80, and it is read like that. The unit is millimeters of mercury because it's a pressure unit. So that would be a typical blood pressure. You're going to measure your own blood pressure using some cuffs and wristbands in the lab. Next, we want to get into the conduction system of the heart, or the electricity of the heart. First, let me talk about a wrong idea. If you were to ask many people what makes someone's heart beat, and really get to what in the body makes the heart beat, many people don't realize it is the heart itself, and it's not the brain. Some people mistakenly think that the brain sends down a signal to the heart every single time a person's heart would beat or contract. That's not what happens. Instead, you have a special group of cells in the heart that creates an action potential. We covered action potentials with the nervous system. The fastest and most prominent group is found in the SA node. You know these little groups of cells as the pacemaker. This is trivial, you don't need to memorize it, but average heart rate is about 72 beats per minute. Well, why does the heart need to send a signal? Why do we need this thing that sends a signal? I'm going to repeat it several times that the whole idea of sending a signal through the heart is to ultimately get the ventricles contract, because that's the main pumping part of the blood or heart, what the heart does as a pump. The SA node is located where the green star is in the upper right atrium. So it sends a signal over to the left atrium, but more importantly and prominent, it sends a signal down to the next yellow circle called the AV node. In this slide, the AV node has a star on it. It's at the base of the right atrium, and again, that's how it gets its name. AV, atrioventricular, right in that border area. The next place that the signal needs to go down to the ventricles. The easiest way to get down to the ventricles is through the septum. But we don't call this through the septum. Instead, we have a name of these forked bundles that send the impulse, and they're called the AV bundles. There's also branches called bundle branches, and these go down the septum. By the way, some people have damage from heart attacks, which are bundle branch damage, and the signal doesn't go through effectively. That's one example of how a heart attack can cause permanent damage to the heart. Well, as we said, these signals, the impulse or signals, have to get to the entire ventricles, left and right, 3D, all the way around the heart. And so they branch upwards, wrap around the heart through the ventricles, branching upwards, and these branches are called Purkinje fibers, named after a person. So then again, ultimately, what should happen, the importance of the impulse being transmitted, is it's going to make the ventricle muscle fibers contract and pump blood. So then the question comes up, how do we know if someone's heart is healthy? We'll get into that in 1 minute. How do we measure the impulse or action potential? Before I go through that, I want to cover a few vocabulary words that come up often. And these are layers of heart cells. I don't know if you ever found the pericardium. You will on the cat dissection. I don't know if you found it when you did your fetal pig dissection, but there is basically a sac, a very thin but strong sac covering the heart called the pericardium. The prefix peri means surrounding or around. The middle layer that you touched with your deer hearts, you saw the thick layer on the left and the thinner layer on the right. The middle layer, again, middle begins with M. Myocardium begins with M. Myo, the prefix MYO, means muscle. This is the muscle layer of the heart. Finally, you have a thin inside or inner layer that basically is the material the valves and slick lining of the heart is made of, and that's called endocardium. The prefix endo means within. So what we've been talking about, all this signaling, the impulses, they are going to go to the muscle layer, the myocardium, and it is similar to what you learned about in the nervous system, say like a motor neuron signaling an effector. So how do we know if somebody's signaling system or electricity or conduction system of the heart is healthy? The way that's measured is an ECG, EKG, same thing, electrocardiogram, that's where they get those 3 letters. And a typical machine is pictured, but again, you don't have to have all those electrodes on the heart at once. Some electrodes can go on the arm and leg, and you can pick up an electrical signal too. You've probably seen the little wave pattern of the electrocardiogram on TV. It can be printed out or can be displayed on a monitor. And basically it's a graph. So let's talk about what this graph looks like. There is a picture of such a graph on a page in your binder. And basically it's a graph where we have time on the x-axis and voltage on the y-axis. It's a wave pattern. Again, basically what this graph means is the heart goes through different levels of voltage in a pattern as the signal goes through the heart, as the impulse goes through the heart. So immediately when you look at this wave pattern, you can see the heart rate. You see under the word tachycardia, someone's got way too fast of a heartbeat. Okay, whereas the graph pictured in blue on this page is more of a normal rate. But there's much more than just the rate. Gee, we could get the rate with a stethoscope or by taking someone's pulse, perhaps. So what happens is they analyze every little part of the entire wave, and there's meanings to the entire wave pattern individually. So we'll break down the wave pattern. Okay, so the very first, again, what's pictured is one heartbeat or one impulse being transmitted through the heart. The first section is called the P wave, and when the voltage goes up and down in millivolts, the P wave represents the electrical change going through the atria, both atria, left and right atrium. Okay, the next part, and I'm not sure why they started with P and not A, the first letter of the alphabet. The next part, you see it goes down to Q, up to R, and down to S. It's often referred to as the QRS spike or QRS complex. This big electrical change in the heart represents, the main thing it represents is the ventricles are depolarizing. The signal is going through the ventricles. Also in the background, but you don't see it because the ventricle electricity overrides it, the atria reset or repolarize. Finally, you have a last little T wave, and this T wave where the millivolts go up and down represents the ventricles repolarizing. Think of it as resetting. So that's one individual heartbeat. So let's talk about what would they know from this? What could they tell? Well, if there's not enough time between the P wave and the Q, then the ventricles are not getting filled up. So if somebody has a short P to Q distance or PQ interval, the ventricles aren't getting enough blood. So even though the ventricles are contracting and doing some work, the blood might not be pumping. Another example, if the QRS complex is spread out in time, that means the electrical impulse or signal is going through the heart, but it's taking way long. The result of that is the ventricles are not going to get signal to contract all at once with force, and the pumping action of the blood will be less efficient or weaker. So there's a couple of examples of how they would break it down. They actually measure the distance on these graphs and put it into time units, and a heart specialist analyzes the EKG. So again, an arrhythmia would mean where the heart is not consistent with what it's doing. So sometimes you can have an irregular rhythm too, where the heart is not doing a complete impulse signal transmission. And oftentimes that's due to damage of your myocardium from, say, a previous heart attack, or maybe some sort of condition the person was born with or has developed. So in the lab, we have some student electrodes, and you'll get a chance to put some electrodes on your arms and see your heart wave